"Lars, my lad!" But it was all in vain. Now he began to understand how matters stood. When Lars had got the scrap of paper he was freed from service at the same time, and now he had taken everything with him. But there was no help for it. There stood the duke in the old hut quite naked, and as for the princess, she was not much better off, although she had her clothes on, for she had got them from her father, so Lars had no power over them. The duke had now to tell the princess everything, and ask her to leave him. He would have to manage as best he could, he said. But she would not hear of it. She well remembered what the parson had said when he married them, and she would never, never leave him, she said. In the meantime the king in his palace had also awakened, and when he looked out of the window he did not see any sign whatever of the other palace, where his daughter and son-in-law lived. He became uneasy, as you may imagine, and called his courtiers. They came in and began to bow and scrape. "Do you see the palace over yonder behind the forest?" he asked. They stretched their necks and stared with all their might. No, they did not see it. "Where had it gone then?" asked the king. Well, really, they did not know. It was not long before the king set out with all his court through the forest, and when he arrived at the place where the palace with the beautiful gardens should have been, he could not see anything but heather and juniper bushes and firs. But then he discovered the old tumble-down hut which stood there among the bushes. He entered the hut and, mercy on us, what a sight met his eyes! There stood his son-in-law quite naked, and his daughter, who had not very many clothes on either, and who was crying and moaning. "Dear, dear, what does all this mean?" said the king. But he did not get any answer, for the duke would rather have died than tell him. The king did his utmost to get him to speak, but in spite of all the king's promises and threats, the duke remained obstinate and would not utter a word. The king then became angry, and no wonder, for now he could see that this grand duke was not what he pretended to be, and so he ordered the duke to be hanged, and that without any loss of time. The princess begged and prayed for mercy, but neither prayers nor tears were of any help now, for an impostor he was, and as an impostor he should die, said the king. And so it had to be. They erected a gallows and placed the rope around the duke's neck. But while they were getting the gallows ready, the princess got hold of the hangman and gave both him and his assistant some money, that they should so manage the hanging of the duke that he should not lose his life, and in the night they were to cut him down, so that he and the princess might then flee the country. And that's how the matter was arranged. In the meantime they had strung up the duke, and the king and his court and all the people went their way. The duke was now in great straits. He had, however, plenty of time to reflect how foolish he had been in not saving some of the crumbs when he was living in plenty, and how unpardonably stupid he had been in letting Lars have the scrap of paper. This vexed him more than all. If only he had it again, he thought, they should see he had been gaining some sense in return for all he had lost. But it is of little use snarling if you haven't got any teeth. Ah, well, well, he sighed, and so he dangled his legs, which was really all he could do. The day passed slowly and tediously for him, and he was not at all displeased when he saw the sun setting behind the forest. But just before it disappeared he heard a fearful shouting, and when he looked down the hill he saw 7 cartloads of worn-out shoes, and on the top of the hindmost cart he saw a little old man in grey clothes and with a red pointed cap on his head. His face was like that of the worst scarecrow, and the rest of him was not very handsome either. He drove straight up to the gallows, and when he arrived right under it, he stopped and looked up at the duke, and then burst out laughing, the ugly old fellow. "How stupid you were," he said. "But what should the fool do with his stupidity if he did not make use of it?" And then he laughed again. "Yes, there you are hanging now, and here am I carting away all the shoes I have worn out for your whims. I wonder if you can read what is written on this bit of paper, and if you recognize it," he said with an ugly laugh, holding up the paper before the duke's eyes. "But all who hang are not dead," and this time it was Lars who was befooled. The duke made a clutch and snatched the paper from him. "Lars, my lad." "What are master's orders?" "Well, you must cut me down from the gallows and put the palace and all the rest in its place again, exactly as it was before. And when the night has set in you must bring back the princess." All went merrily as in a dance, and before long everything was in its place, just as it was when Lars took himself off. When the king awoke the next morning, he looked out of the windows as was his custom, and there stood the palace again, with the weathercocks glittering so beautifully in the sunshine. He called his courtiers, and they came and began to bow and scrape. They stretched their necks as far as they could, and stared and gaped. "Do you see the palace over there?" said the king. Yes, of course they did. The king then sent for the princess, but she was not to be found. He then went out to see if his son-in-law was still hanging on the gallows, but neither son-in-law nor gallows was to be seen. He had to lift off his crown and scratch his head, but that did not improve matters. He could not make head or tail of either one thing or the other. He set off at once with all his court through the forest, and when he came to the place where the palace should stand, there it stood, sure enough. The garden and the roses were exactly as they used to be, and the duke's people were to be seen everywhere among the trees. His son-in-law and his daughter received him on the steps, dressed in their finest clothes. "Well, I never saw the like of this," said the king to himself. He could scarcely believe his own eyes, so wonderful did it all seem to him. "God's peace be with you, father, and welcome here," said the duke. The king stood staring at him. "Are you my son-in-law?" he asked. "Well, I suppose I am," said the duke. "Who else should I be?" "Did I not order you to be hanged yesterday, like any common thief?" said the king. "I think you must have been bewitched on the way," said the duke with a laugh. "Do you think I am the man to let myself be hanged? Or is there anyone here who dares to believe it?" he said, and looked so fiercely at the courtiers that they felt as if they were being pierced through and through. They bowed and scraped and cringed before him. Who could believe such a thing? Was it at all likely? "Well, if there is anyone who dares to say the king could have wished me such evil, let him speak out," said the duke, and fixed his eyes upon them still more fiercely than before. Then they went on bowing and scraping and cringing. How could anyone dare say such a thing? No, they had more sense than that, they should hope. The king did not know what to believe, for when he looked at the duke he thought he never could have wished him such evil, but still he was not quite convinced. "Did I not come here yesterday, and was not the whole palace gone, and was there not an old hut in its place? And did not I go into that hut, and did not you stand stark naked right before my eyes?" he asked. "I wonder the king can talk so," said the duke. "I think the trolls must have bewitched your eyes in the forest, and made you quite crazy. Or what do you think?" he said, and turned round to the courtiers. They bowed and bowed till their backs were bent double, and agreed with everything he said. There could be no mistake about